We Will Not Suffer in Silence presents Code Words, The Segregationist Chronicles, Volume 1.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this.
All right, I won't hear.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that.
School choice? Maybe?
Our schools used to be an elevator to the middle class. Now they're stalled on the ground floor. They're like Soviet-era department stores that are run for the benefit of the clerks and not the customers, for the teachers and the administrators and not the students.
Donald Trump will rebuild our education system and give every parent of every income and every ethnic background a choice about where their children go to school.
It's African Americans who remember generations of hollow promises about safe streets and better schools, and they know Donald Trump will fight for equal opportunity, and he loves educational choice.
And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me?
We will rescue kids from failing schools by helping their parents send them to a safe school of their choice.
I'm for school choice, yes, right? Yes. Which is the code word that comes after, exactly, right, the Brown decision.
Yes.
Right, like it has a very specific historical origin.
Led by Thurgood Marshall and other young lawyers like Robert Carter, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was running or aiding cases all over the country. The court picked 5 and consolidated them into one set of arguments, forever known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. As oral arguments approached, people camped outside the building to assure themselves a seat in the courtroom. NAACP lawyers Marshall and Carter were up against a formidable adversary, John W. Davis, a former presidential candidate making the last of his 140 appearances at the Supreme Court. But his arguments had a familiar ring. Separate wasn't necessarily unequal. Blacks should be happy with the way things were. Didn't states have the right to educate their children as they saw fit? When the 3 days of arguments were over, Davis was heard to remark, "I think we've got it won, 5-4, or maybe 6-3. The justices scheduled another hearing on the case, but before that could happen, Chief Justice Vincent died of a heart attack. President Eisenhower chose to nominate Earl Warren, formerly the governor of California. On May 17, 1954, there were signs. Some of the justices' wives showed up. Some clerks were tipped off. Then reporters rushed the courtroom.
Warren starts off in a bland manner, and you can't tell for a while as he's delivering the opinion what the outcome is going to be. And then he comes to the key line and he says, "And we unanimously hold that separate but equal has no place in the Constitution." And it was just electric in the courtroom when he said unanimous.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we unanimously hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson in education is no more, and in practice, Plessy v. Ferguson itself is no more. The era of Jim Crow, constitutionally speaking, is over.
This was precisely what we urged them, almost in that language. So it was gratifying to have the opinion come down almost in the language of the argument that we made to them.
In 1951, I'd used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Brown said that that was over. The hand-me-down tubas that I played in the high school band from the white high schools, it said to me that that was ended. And it said to me that at some point, I would not have to travel from Atlanta to Greencastle in Indiana to get an undergraduate degree. That my family, my cousins, my neighbors could go to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 was for me the Magna Carta. It was the second emancipation. It was a great moment.
Once a year, we do what's called a school swap, where students that go to county high schools attend a school in the city for one day, and then students in the city attend a school in the county for one day.
I went in, and the first thing that I noticed, actually, was all this stuff around here. I'm talking about stuff that looked like it costs lots of money. The teachers come in, they can get right on topic. They have multiple computers that they can use, and it's like, wow. And then I related back to my school, well, we don't have all that.
So then, right, charter schools form as the first charter schools were a reaction to the Brown decision.
The wealthiest, wokest districts is constructing a plan to do something about its segregation. But as the Chancellor of New York City Public Schools noted on Twitter, it's not going over well with everyone.
You're telling them you're going to go to a school that's not going to educate you in the same way you've been educated. Life sucks. Is that what the DOE wants to say?
That clip from a public meeting about the plan turned a local news story into a national conversation. New York City's District 3 includes both the white and wealthier parts of the Upper West Side and black, brown, and poorer sections of southern Harlem. There are 16 middle schools in the district, and thanks to a complicated set of admissions criteria, the top performing schools are dominated by affluent white and Asian kids. Fewer than 10% of the students at those schools come from low-income families. In some other parts of the district, almost 100% of the kids come from low-income families of color.
But that does not mean everybody, I am not saying that everybody sends their kid to charter school is a segregationist, but it was the agenda of segregationist organizations to diminish the power of public education. And that hurts everybody, in my opinion. And so what happens is now we have a language that is not overtly racist. Well, it wasn't, right? We have a language that, wasn't as overtly racist, but in policy was really damaging.
How is it possible that our nation's schools are by some measures more segregated now than they have been in over 4 decades? Well, it turns out places like New York haven't so much resegregated as never really bothered integrating in the first place, because the 1964 Civil Rights Act was very carefully crafted by northern lawmakers. It targeted the kind of segregation by law which existed in the South, so you couldn't have a school that was officially designated whites only, but it exempted the so-called racial imbalance of northern schools. So if a New York school was all white because it was drawing from an all-white area, even if that area had been kept that way due to a host of explicitly racist housing policies, that was somehow fine. And if you're thinking that is some hypocritical bullshit, you are not alone. Malcolm X was pointing this out in New York at the time.
You don't have to go to Mississippi to find a segregated school system. We have it right here in New York City. It shows that the problems that the white liberals have been pointing the finger at the southern segregationists and condemning them for exist right here in New York City.
When I started off, I wasn't going to tell a story about secession districts. My story was going to be about the federal government's failure to enforce the last 170 or so at this point school desegregation orders. And so what we decided to do is we wanted to zoom in on where segregation was getting worse the most rapidly. And that's how Jefferson County got on my radar, because I mean, when Leslie graduated from Gardendale High School in 2001, Jefferson County schools were 80% white. It was a pretty, I mean, I think there were about 25% kids who qualified for free and reduced lunch. And by the time she got back with her kids, Jefferson County had moved to Huntsville, went to college up there, stayed up there for a little while, came back in, I think, 2012.
That's about right.
About right. And it had transformed into this district that was majority Black and Latino, and about 60% of students qualified for free and reduced lunch. And what had happened over those 12 years is 2 more school districts had broken off from Jefferson County schools. So let's go back a little bit. So when Brown comes down, there are 5 school districts in Jefferson County. Immediately, 4 new school districts break off, and they form some of the wealthiest school districts in the South, actually. So they break off, and then there's a lull, and then it starts to really become popular again in the early 2000s. So yeah, we get 2 school districts break off, and each time a school district breaks off, there's even more pressure on towns like Gardendale, because, you know, I met some people who had overtly racist feelings in Gardendale, but I met a lot of people who sort of remind me that there's a fight going on the Upper West Side of Manhattan right now, that we don't want to diversify our schools because what the effect's going to be, there are going to be less spots in the good schools for my kids. And yeah, so I think like what's happening is, yes, there was some overt racism, but we've kind of like really rationalized like the rationing that we do, right? Like there are only going to be so many good schools. And what we know is the more Black and Latino kids there are in that school, it's more likely that that is not going to be one of the high-performing, high-funded schools. And I really think that's what was driving Gardendale, and I think that's what's driving, I mean, we see this fight in every corner of this country at this point.
South states. And then I think there's also this notion that sort of, that these rabid, you know, the George Wallaces of the world rev up the base, right? And then they begin to protest. But in the aftermath of Brown, in the first 3 months, and the first petitions came in 2 days after the Brown decision, 80,000 white North Carolinians signed petitions that agreed to end public schooling if the schools were going to be integrated.
No more public school at all?
If the choice was to be integrated or not, 80,000 said they were willing to give
Just
up.
wanted to clarify.
Yes. Okay. Right, and it goes from Burgaw to Clyde, right? It covers the state. And in fact, urban areas, Greensboro had the most of these petitions. And these weren't called on by the governors. Nobody stood up and said, you need to sign those petitions. It was really grassroots local efforts. Many times, right, women circulating, not all, but many times women circulating these petitions. Pender County had a particularly well-organized segregation group. They petitioned the governor. They circulate a really incendiary report about what integration would do in New Hanover County schools. If you look at the newspapers in North Carolina, women and men, but women write and list all the reasons that integration is going to upend their world. Teenagers, right, and say, we know better, right? We know better than to go to integrated schools, espousing the lessons that they have learned, right, and the generations that they have been taught. And so I think if nothing else, North Carolina in this period should remind us to look at the outcomes of policy and the advocates of particular policy to determine, right, rather than the sort of whether it was violent or not, or whether it was newsworthy or not. And I think North Carolina, it's no wonder that the busing decision in Swan versus Mecklenburg, I don't think came out of North Carolina, because it was a state that had managed through policies to avoid really meaningful integration.
One of the important things to note, though, is that a lot of education policy is driven at the state level. And so there have been 71 school districts that have pulled away from their larger school districts since 2000. There are 30 states that actually have a law on the books that allow this to happen. In some cases, they have a manual that they publish to talk about how you can create your own school system. Only of those 30 states, only 9 of them mandate that there be any consideration for a difference in socioeconomics or a difference in funds, and only 5 require that there's a review of what is going to happen, how it's going to affect racial demographics. 5 out of 30. And so, we're giving folks basically the incentive to pull away from their school districts by allowing them to keep their property taxes, and we're permitting it at the state level, and in some cases even encouraging it.
Well, they win the textbook war, and they win it early, and they win it for a long time. And this, too, is an irony of sort of the progressive era state building, is that there was a state centralization of some education policies, and the South, ironically, embraced statewide textbook selection committees before any other region in the country. I know this seems really wonky, right? But I'll be quick. So this means that publishers respond, they want the South's contracts because it's a statewide contract, not a county by county contract. And so white women who are doing all sorts of things, right, building monuments, have an essay contest, the UDC is particularly involved in this, begin to send lists of sort of litmus tests to textbook selection committees of what you should approve, and then educate the women in their communities to sort of censor the textbooks that are being chosen, right, by these state textbook selection committees, to make sure that they call enslaved people servants, and to make sure that it's the war between the states and not the Civil War, and to make sure that industrial labor is understood to be exploitive and maybe as exploited as enslaved labor. And so there's a list, right? And all you have to do to control the textbooks is to shape and influence the textbook selection committee. And the South is ahead of everybody on this. Other states don't do this quite as quickly. And that will continue, right? Once you're in that sort of textbook censorship mode, then after World War II, you've got to censor it for communism. Right? And then when the UN begins to espouse multicultural education, well, that can also upend racial segregation, segregationists believe, and upend stories of American exceptionalism and the celebration of white sort of forefathers. And so you've already trained, right, generations after generations of women to then go in and lobby against these textbooks.
Speaking at the White House Conference on American History today, President Trump announced that he would be signing an executive order to create the 1776 Commission, which would promote a, quote, patriotic education. He also blasted efforts to re-examine American history with a deeper emphasis on slavery and racism.
By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen. Critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together, will destroy our country.
Come to get trained, Mildred Lewis Rutherford makes sure that the Lucy Cobb Institute houses them. She gives lectures, right? She makes sure that the teachers who are being trained in the kind of history that she advocated in her own publication, right? And this was Miss Rutherford's scrapbook, funded by publishers' advertising, textbooks, the South's responsibility. And then there's essay contests, and the UDC starts them, and these kind of essay contests, again, normalize white supremacist politics and segregation decade after decade. I mean, you think, right, you're in school, and the teachers that you respect and the community members that you're told to sort of respect say, oh, what you should do in 1960, ignore the sit-ins, you should write an essay on why social separation of the races is important.
And your family will be proud of you because you'll get your picture in the local paper, right?
Yes.
And an article will be written about
and
you.
they'll be more than proud. You get $500 in 1960, which would have paid for 4 years. This woman's from Mississippi. It would have paid for 4 years of tuition at Ole Miss.
Wow.
I would like my daughter to have written an essay that paid for 4 years of tuition at Chapel Hill. I'm glad it wasn't on that subject.
We kind of came across the issue of modern day segregation by actually looking at the way that we fund schools. And so if you take federal funds out of the equation, schools are still funded about 50% from local property taxes and about 50% from state funds. So in essence, the amount of money that you have in your community that's driven by your property wealth is driving how much money you have for your schools. And so one of the reasons why we really wanted to focus on this is looking at Camden. So the darker school district, like right along the edge of the border, is Camden. There are 32 school districts within a 5-mile radius of Camden. So you have to ask yourself the question, how is that even possible and what's driving that? So we actually started to drill into the differences in terms of funding. So Camden is able to raise only $900 per student from their local property taxes. Haddon Township, which is one of the non-contiguous school districts about 3 miles away, raises $11,000 from their property taxes. It's impossible to think that modern day segregation, both I think socioeconomic and race-based, is not in some ways informed by the way that we fund schools. So as we started to look into the geography of school districts, we found the Birmingham, Alabama area. And the first time that my staff showed this to me, I thought, why is this picture so pixelated? This is the actual school district of Jefferson County. That's the darker green, and what Birmingham and all of the school districts around it actually look like. So we're going to be talking about the proposed red area. Still not pixelated. These are literally borders that are drawn around blocks of houses. Gardendale, Alabama, which is a community that was looking to pull away from Jefferson County, has a 7% poverty rate. To put that in perspective, that's lower than the Santa Monica, Malibu school district. And the rest of Jefferson County, their poverty is about 4 times that. But this isn't an issue that stands alone. 4 years ago, the state of Tennessee actually amended their law to allow communities to separate from their larger county-based school district. And so between 2010 and 2014, what you'll see is that there were 5 border changes. Now the county that surrounds Memphis has 6 new school districts, simply because legislators allowed for communities to pull away.
Well, I want to thank Ryan for introducing reparations into the conversation. I've done a substantial amount of work on this topic, particularly in conjunction with my partner, Kirsten Mullen, and we have a new book on reparations that will be available in April called From Here to Equality. In the final chapter, we try to sketch how you might actually execute a reparations program. I think one of the critical things that we have to recognize is the magnitude of the racial wealth gap. And I think we've talked about the racial wealth gap here, but I don't think we've offered any numbers to give people a sense of the scale of that disparity. So if you were to examine the American population as a whole, Black Americans are about 13% of the nation's population, but Black Americans possess less than 3% of the nation's wealth. What that translates into at the average is an $800,000 differential per Black and white household. That is to say, the average Black household has $800,000 less in net worth than the average white household. And I'm talking about looking at the average or the mean instead of the median, which Ryan referred to, because 94% of the wealth that is held by white households is held by white households who have a net worth above the white median. And so if we're thinking about closing the racial wealth gap, we have to think about closing it at the mean rather than at the median to absorb the full differential in the proportion of wealth that's held by the two communities. So if you were to bring the Black share of wealth at least to the Black share of the population, it would require an additional at least $10 trillion. And so the other kinds of programs or initiatives that we're talking about are not going to come anywhere close to trying to eliminate or eradicate a gap at that magnitude. And so that's why we need to turn to something like a reparations program, which is specifically aimed at building Black assets to a level that would be comparable to the level of assets that are held by white Americans on average.
We talk about expropriation. It does basically talk about removing wealth from the rich and delivering it to the poor via, not to the poorer parts of society, via kind of giving them money at 25 by providing a kind of minimum wage that's around 60% of the average. This is a big wealth transference you're talking about. You're talking about taking a lot of money away from the rich and distributing it to the rest of society.
Okay, keep cool, keep quiet.
I'm very cool. I'm very cool.
I'm not going to expropriate you. Okay, this is a book telling the story of how economic prosperity during the 20th century came from a huge reduction of inequality. So if you look at the past century, you know, what we've seen is an enormous reduction of inequality that was achieved through education, huge public investment in education, that was achieved through progressive taxation. And indeed, I revisit, you know, the historical experience whereby in the US, starting in the 1920s and 1930s with Roosevelt until 1980.
Thatcher, Reagan, yeah.
So from 1930 to 1980, you know, the top income tax rate in the US was on average 82%. And believe it or not, but this did not destroy American capitalism, you know, otherwise we would have noticed it. And what I do in this book is to try to bring a lot of historical evidence showing that, in fact, it worked pretty well, both to reduce inequality, but also to invest in public infrastructure, in education, which delivered in the end more economic prosperity. And, you know, there was the discourse in the 1980s saying, well, you know, by Reagan saying we're going to reduce top tax rate and this is going to stimulate more innovation, more growth. You know, this could have been right. But 30 years later, what we've seen is that growth rate in the US have been divided by 2, you know, in the 30 years after the Reagan turn. And today, you know, you have lots of people, you know, in the middle class and the lower socioeconomic groups in the US, in the UK, who feel that globalization has not been working very well for them. And now
there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody. The question
let me
is,
just... So a lot of people think that, oh my God, we have this $21 trillion deficit and that we have to pay that back with our taxes. But that's not really true, right?
No, it's not. It's not true at all. Like, I'm sitting at my husband's desk. He happens to have a Post-it notepad here. So can I, like, let's just say that I'm the government and I'm going to spend $2 billion, whatever we want to call these. I'm going to put these into the economy. So here they go. I'm handing them to you. You're the economy. Now you have these 2. I spent them in, but I'm going to take one back from you. And I'm going to call that a tax. So I collected this one back. It's gone. but you still have this one, okay? So I'm running a deficit. I put 2 in, I take 1 out. It's my deficit, but you're sitting holding this, and this is your surplus. Now, this is the money I spent into the economy and didn't tax back, okay? This is your dollar. But now I'm going to borrow this dollar from you. So I'm going to get a different color paper called a treasury bond, and I'm going to take this from you, and I'm going to give you this. So now you have blue instead of orange. That's me borrowing from you. Okay, but the money to buy the treasury bond came from the government spending. The money to buy this came from the fact that I gave you this. So I'm providing both the money that you use to pay your taxes and the money you use to buy bonds from me.
So, yes. Yes, I'm, you know, the more I listen to you, the more I'm following this. Here, there's one more thing I want to add. So the point is that since we print our own money, that deficits don't really necessarily matter, and that the only thing you really have to be careful of is that you don't print too much money, because then, let's say that the economy is already humming at like a peak. If you put more money in, then that'll make inflation happen, right? And so that's what you need to be careful of.
YC4Me is a phenomenal group made up of a lot of the people you see behind me, and we actually got in touch with some of these young people and asked them to share their perspectives on some changes they'd like to see, some problems they've already identified, and just taking on this whole concept of segregation and integrating schools. So have a look.
Almost exactly a year ago, I visited a school that was incredibly diverse. It had so many different types of students in the classroom, from so many different backgrounds. And that idea of inclusivity felt so abnormal to me because I was so used to the idea of segregation. And it was at that moment that I questioned why this happens.
Segregation to me is not just being physically separated, but I think a lot of it comes from this lack of understanding between us and not wanting to see things from other people's perspectives.
I think segregation it's like a border. It keeps people away from each other.
My school doesn't have resources or relationships between teachers and students.
My mom has always put me in the best schools, I guess, and that's always been in a school where there's majority white students.
Being part of the majority, it was not so apparent to me in the beginning.
I fear segregation because it essentially gives the input that some students are better than me because of how they look or because of how much money they have.
What decision makers are currently missing about this issue of school segregation is that the students that are currently being segregated will in turn become the new decision makers. So if you want decisions to be made that are equitable, just, and fair, the schools need to also be equitable, just, and fair.
To integrate New York City schools, I want you to focus on our resource allocation.
One of the things we would like to do is have weighted admissions into our schools,
5 AP classes, 5 PSAL sports teams in every school,
as well as developing screens that do not have racial or socioeconomic bias within them.
I'm very grateful, and I think we all are, that you have come and opened up this conversation and allowed us to talk to you about this, but I think that what we really want is for you to follow concrete policy proposals to actually take steps towards having full school integration happen.